Trash like you doesn't belong in a place of justice. Those words would haunt Officer Mike Stevenson for the rest of his life, but not because he said them. Because of who he said them to. Because 6 hours earlier, the woman he called trash was walking up the courthouse steps in a teal cardigan and jeans, carrying a briefcase, just trying to get to work. And in 6 hours, she would be sitting in the judge's seat, wearing judicial robes, holding his entire future in her hands. This is the story of how one catastrophic assumption destroyed a corrupt cop's career and transformed an entire justice system. But first, you need to see what he did to her on those steps. Before this story explodes, do me one favor, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel exposes injustice and celebrates accountability. If that matters to you, you're in the right place. Now watch what happens when a corrupt cop finally meets his match. Judge Brianna Sinclair adjusted her comfortable teal cardigan against the crisp October morning as she climbed the steps toward the downtown federal courthouse. Her designer Armani suit was at the cleaners. Last night's fundraising gala for underprivileged law students had ended with red wine all over her jacket. So this morning, for the first time in 20 years, she'd thrown on casual clothes from her weekend wardrobe. Faded jeans with a hole in the knee, beat-up Nike sneakers, a comfortable teal cardigan over a patterned blouse that her sister had given her last Christmas. The leather briefcase in her hand, Italian leather, a gift from her late father, was the only expensive item she carried. Inside were case files for today's hearings, a civil rights violation case at 9 a.m., a custody hearing at 11, and a sentencing at 2 p.m. Officer Mike Stevenson spotted her from his post at the courthouse entrance, his lip curling in disgust. Another homeless rat trying to sneak in where she doesn't belong. He'd been assigned courthouse security for 3 months, a demotion after his 4th internal affairs complaint in 2 years. But he didn't see it as a demotion. He saw it as his duty. Protecting real citizens from people like her. Hey, you. Stevenson's voice cracked through the quiet morning like a whip. His partner, Officer James Willie, pushed off from where he'd been leaning against the stone pillar, a smirk already spreading across his face. Willie was younger, hungry, eager to prove himself to his mentor. And Stevenson had taught him well. Authority first, questions never. Brianna stopped mid-step, turning with the calm confusion of someone who couldn't possibly imagine she was the problem. Yes, officer? Where do you think you're going? Stevenson swaggered forward, his hand resting on his baton. His eyes raked over her appearance with the kind of contempt usually reserved for garbage on the sidewalk. I'm going to work, Brianna replied evenly, adjusting her briefcase. 20 years on the federal bench had taught her patience, composure, and the art of de-escalation. Willie barked out a laugh that echoed off the courthouse columns. Work? Lady, the only work you know is panhandling. This is a courthouse, not a soup kitchen. Brianna's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. Officers, I understand there may be some confusion, but if you'll allow me to show you my identification. I don't need to see nothing from you, Stevenson cut her off, stepping so close she could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with something else, the unmistakable stench of someone who enjoyed asserting dominance over those he deemed beneath him. Ma'am, you need to vacate these premises immediately, Willie added, pulling out his phone. We don't allow vagrants loitering around federal property. It's a security risk. I'm not a vagrant. Brianna's voice took on the authoritative edge she used in her courtroom, firm, commanding, impossible to ignore. My name is Judge Brianna Sinclair. I work in this building. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me. The laughter that erupted from both officers was ugly, performative, designed to humiliate. Oh, she's a judge. Stevenson howled, slapping his thigh theatrically. Willie, you hear this? We got ourselves a federal judge here. Should we roll out the red carpet? That's precious, Willie agreed, tapping his phone screen to start recording. Another one with delusions of grandeur. Last week we had a doctor, week before that a lawyer. Now we got a judge. What's next, the president? Brianna reached into her briefcase, slowly, deliberately, but Stevenson moved with practiced speed. His hand clamped around her wrist like a vice, yanking her arm upward. "I said hands where I can see them," he barked. "I'm simply retrieving my credentials," Brianna began, but Willie had already grabbed her other arm from behind. "She's resisting," Willie shouted to no one in particular, though his phone was still recording. What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence that would be captured by 5 different security cameras, but felt like slow motion to everyone watching. Stevenson twisted Brianna's arm behind her back with such force she gasped. Willie's foot lashed out, sweeping her legs. She crashed onto the concrete steps, federal courthouse steps she'd walked up every working day for 2 decades, her cheek slamming against the cold stone. The Italian leather briefcase flew from her grip, exploding open. Legal documents, confidential case files, scattered across the courthouse entrance like confetti at a funeral. "Trash like you doesn't belong in a place of justice," Stevenson snarled, pressing his knee into her spine while Willie wrenched her arms behind her back. The metal handcuffs bit into her wrists with unnecessary force, each click a small violation, each tightening a deliberate cruelty. A dozen early morning courthouse employees had stopped on their way inside, security guards, clerks, junior attorneys clutching coffee cups. Their faces showed shock, discomfort, the kind of moral paralysis that comes from watching injustice unfold while wearing business casual. But no one moved to help. No one questioned the officers. No one even pulled out their phones to record. The blue uniform carried an authority that turned witnesses into statues, transformed citizens into cowards. This was how systems perpetuated themselves, not through malice alone, but through the quiet complicity of good people who looked away. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," Brianna said through gritted teeth, her cheek still pressed against the stone that bore the inscription, "Equal justice under law." "The only mistake," Willie shot back, hauling her roughly to her feet, "is you thinking you could just roll up to a federal courthouse dressed like you robbed a Goodwill. Time somebody taught you about respect." They dragged her like a criminal, like property, through the courthouse doors she'd walked through freely for 20 years. Past the security checkpoint where guards she'd greeted by name every morning suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Past the administrative offices where clerks whispered behind cupped hands, already spreading gossip that would be obsolete in an hour. Past the marble halls adorned with portraits of distinguished jurists, one of whom was her. The humiliation wasn't incidental. It was the point. It was calculated, performative, designed to demonstrate power and reinforce hierarchy. They burst through the doors of Courtroom 4A, her courtroom, with a theatrical flair of hunters returning with a prize. Substitute Judge Harold Peterson looked up from his notes, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. He was 72, semi-retired, called in to cover Brianna's docket while she was supposed to be at a judicial conference in D.C. She'd canceled at the last minute, a stomach bug that had cleared up by evening. "Your Honor," Stevenson announced with barely suppressed pride, "we've apprehended a trespasser attempting to infiltrate the courthouse." Subject was carrying stolen legal documents and became violent when questioned. Brianna's eyes swept the courtroom with a practiced assessment of someone who'd presided here for 2 decades. There was her nameplate, temporarily covered by a placard reading, Honorable H. Peterson. There was her gavel, the one her father gave her when she was sworn in. There was her chair, her bench, her domain. And there were these 2 officers, constructing their lies in real time, performing for an audience that wanted to believe them. "Officers," Judge Peterson said slowly, suspicion creeping into his voice, "what exactly did this woman do?" "She was attempting unauthorized access to a federal facility, Your Honor," Willie jumped in, his voice smooth with practiced deception. "When we confronted her, she claimed to be." He paused for dramatic effect, "a federal judge." The way he said it, with exaggerated disbelief, with mockery dripping from every syllable, made several people in the gallery chuckle. The absurdity of it. A woman in ripped jeans claiming to be a judge. "And did you verify her identification?" Peterson asked. Something in his tone suggested doubt, a judicial instinct that whispered something isn't right here. She refused to provide identification, Your Honor. Stevenson lied with the smoothness of someone who'd done this many times before. Became belligerent, verbally abusive. We had no choice but to use appropriate force to secure the scene. From the defendant's table where they'd shoved her, Brianna watched in silence. Her hands were still cuffed behind her back. A purple bruise was already blooming across her left cheekbone. Her teal cardigan had torn at the sleeve during the assault, the fabric hanging loose. The prosecutor assigned to Peterson's docket, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Reeves, ambitious and politically minded, leaned forward with interest. This could be good for her career. A homeless woman attempting to breach federal security. Easy conviction. Good press. Your Honor, Stevenson continued, emboldened by what he perceived as a receptive audience, in my 15 years of service, I've encountered this type repeatedly. Individuals with apparent mental health issues, possibly substance abuse problems, attempting to gain unauthorized access to government buildings. She was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. We suspect identity theft, possibly part of a larger fraud operation. Identity theft? Judge Peterson raised an eyebrow. That's a serious allegation. Yes, Your Honor. The documents had judicial letterhead, case numbers, sensitive information. No civilian should have access to materials like these. Stevenson's confidence grew with each lie. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to restricted areas. The irony was so thick it practically suffocated the oxygen in the room. But Stevenson pressed on, oblivious to the trap he was constructing for himself with every word. Furthermore, Your Honor, Willie added, stepping forward like an understudy eager for his moment in the spotlight, the defendant became physically aggressive during the arrest. Nearly broke Officer Stevenson's wrist. We can request medical documentation if needed. It was a masterclass in fiction. Each officer building on the other's lies, supporting each other's narrative, constructing a story so complete that it felt true. This was how innocent people ended up in prison. This was how the system failed over and over, because uniforms were believed over citizens, because power protected power. In the defendant's chair, Brianna sat perfectly still. Her hands folded in her lap despite the handcuffs. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't smiling. She was waiting, taking mental notes of every lie, every fabrication, every detail that would soon unravel not just their case, but their entire careers. She was watching Officer Stevenson testify under oath, commit perjury, in her own courtroom, in front of her own bench, sitting in her own defendant's chair. And he had absolutely no idea that the woman he'd brutalized was the one person in this building with the power to destroy him. Your Honor, Stevenson concluded, straightening his uniform with smug satisfaction, incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some individuals only respond to authority backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Officer Stevenson, Prosecutor Reeves added, sensing an opportunity, in your professional opinion, does the defendant pose an ongoing security risk? Absolutely, ma'am. Individuals like this often have a pattern of attempting to infiltrate government facilities. I recommend she be held without bail and undergo psychiatric evaluation. Judge Peterson nodded gravely. The court appreciates your thorough response, Officer Stevenson. As Stevenson stepped back from the witness podium, he caught Brianna's eye one final time. He winked at her, a gesture of complete dominance, total victory, the kind of alpha male posturing that said I own you, and there's nothing you can do about it. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire career. The defendant may now make a statement, Judge Peterson announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before he passed sentence on this mentally disturbed vagrant. Brianna rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Despite the purple bruise spreading across her cheek, despite the torn cardigan sleeve and the disheveled hair, despite sitting in handcuffs accused of crimes she didn't commit, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. There was something about her posture, her bearing, the way she held her head. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice cut through the room like a bell, clear, controlled, carrying an authority that seemed to fill every corner. It was the voice of someone who had commanded respect in courtrooms for 2 decades. It was the voice of power. Judge Peterson blinked. Something in her tone was unexpected, professional, precise. This wasn't the rambling of a mentally ill vagrant or the desperate pleading of someone caught red-handed. First, I'd like to address several factual inaccuracies in Officer Stevenson's testimony. Brianna's eyes swept the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had nodded along with the lies. According to his statement, I was trespassing on federal property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 7:47 a.m. this morning. She turned slightly to address Judge Peterson directly. "Your Honor, I'm certain you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The court stenographer's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Prosecutor Reeves frowned. This wasn't the emotional outburst they'd been expecting. Furthermore, Brianna continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone completely comfortable in legal settings, Officer Stevenson testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely. She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been haphazardly collected. Those documents are indeed authentic federal legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Peterson interrupted, his discomfort growing. "Miss, what exactly is your profession?" Brianna paused, and for the first time, allowed herself a slight smile. "Sinclair. Dr. Sinclair. And I believe we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." Officer Stevenson felt something cold slither down his spine. Something was very, very wrong. "Your Honor, if I may continue," Brianna said, her voice now taking on steel. Officer Stevenson also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during this morning's incident. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. The young paralegal in the back row suddenly sat up straighter. Something about this woman's voice, her mannerisms, the way she moved through legal arguments like dancing through steps she'd memorized decades ago. Now, regarding Officer Stevenson's claim that his body camera malfunctioned. Brianna's voice dropped, became dangerous. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of alternative recordings when claimed evidence is unavailable. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his judicial instincts now screaming that something unprecedented was happening. "What kind of evidence are you referring to?" "Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body camera footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions." The color drained from Stevenson's face like water from a broken dam. "I would like to formally request," Brianna continued with the practiced precision of someone who'd made thousands of such requests, that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 7:45 and 8:15 a.m. This includes, but is not limited to, courthouse security footage, body camera backup files, and any mobile device recordings made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Reeves stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Brianna turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made Reeves take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro-se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. I'm simply ensuring that obligation is met. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases went. Ever. Your Honor, Brianna said, walking as much as the handcuffs would allow toward the evidence table, I'd also like to address Officer Stevenson's characterization of my presence as suspicious or unauthorized. She pointed to a specific document among her scattered belongings. This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to, she caught herself. I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. Bailiff Robert Henderson, a large man who'd worked courthouse security for 18 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Brianna with growing recognition, his face transforming from confusion to realization to absolute horror. He knew that voice. He knew that bearing. He'd seen her every working day for 18 years. Oh God. Oh God. Officer Stevenson testified that I claimed to be someone important, Brianna continued, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. She paused, surveying the courtroom like she owned it, because she did. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Stevenson's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. Judge Peterson's voice came out hoarse. What kind of documentation? Brianna reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly, deliberately. My federal judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office. She placed it on the table. My building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's entry code. Another item. And my official identification. She held up a leather credential wallet, and even from across the room, the gold federal judicial seal was clearly visible, catching the fluorescent light like a badge of truth. Bailiff Henderson stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. Your Honor, Brianna said quietly, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Stevenson assaulted this morning. Perhaps we should recess, she suggested, not requested, suggested, so that proper identifications can be verified. Judge Peterson stared at the credential wallet, then at Brianna's face, then at Bailiff Henderson, who was nodding frantically, his face pale as death. Court will recess for 15 minutes, Peterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the gavel fell, Officer Mike Stevenson felt his entire world beginning to crumble around him. The confident smirk had slid off his face like wax melting. His hands were shaking. Willie beside him had gone green, looked like he might vomit. Whatever game Stevenson thought he was playing, whatever power he thought he wielded, he was beginning to realize he might not have understood the rules at all. He just testified, under oath, about brutalizing someone while they trespassed. But what if they hadn't been trespassing? What if they'd been going to work? What if? No. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse transformed from a place of routine procedure into a powder keg of whispered chaos. But in a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, away from the panic and the spreading rumors and the frantic phone calls being made, Brianna Sinclair sat alone in temporary silence. Bailiff Henderson had fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock her handcuffs. "Judge Sinclair," he'd whispered, his voice thick with horror. "Jesus Christ, Judge Sinclair. I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you when they brought you in like that, I should have." "It's all right, Henderson," Brianna had replied softly, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had bitten deep. "You weren't part of this. But I need you to do something for me. Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers and bring me my judicial robes. The black ones with the gold trim." She'd looked him directly in the eye. "And Henderson, bring my gavel too. The engraved one for my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson had nodded vigorously and hurried out, leaving Brianna alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself the way she'd learned to do during her 20 years on the bench. This morning, she had been Judge Brianna Sinclair, respected jurist, protector of constitutional rights, guardian of justice. In the span of 30 minutes, she'd been transformed into a victim, a defendant, a woman in handcuffs facing fabricated charges. But that transformation was temporary. Now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Now it was time to remind 2 police officers, and everyone else in that courtroom, what happened when you mistook power for justice, when you confused a uniform for righteousness, when you forgot that the law applies to everyone, especially to those who enforce it. In 15 minutes, when she walked back into that courtroom, everything would change. But first, she needed to remember why she'd chosen this path. She needed to remember the journey that had brought her here, from a young girl growing up in the projects to the youngest federal judge in state history. She needed to remember why she dedicated her life to justice. Because in 15 minutes, she was going to deliver it. But before that moment arrived, before Henderson returned with her robes, before she reclaimed her power, the performance was still unfolding in her courtroom. Officer Mike Stevenson was doing what he'd done dozens of times before, spinning the story, controlling the narrative, making himself the hero. Inside courtroom 4A, Officer Stevenson straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. He had done this dance many times before. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like her. Judge Harold Peterson sat behind Brianna's bench, a pale, thin man in his early 70s, known throughout the district for his pro-prosecution leanings. He'd sentenced more defendants to maximum sentences than any other judge in the courthouse's 50-year history. To Stevenson, he was the perfect audience. Prosecutor Sandra Reeves sat at the state's table, her ambitious eyes gleaming. Mid-40s, up for promotion to chief prosecutor, she saw every case as a stepping stone. A homeless woman attempting to breach federal security? Easy conviction. Career-building press. She leaned forward with barely concealed excitement. At the defendant's table, Brianna sat with her hands still cuffed behind her back. The purple bruise on her left cheekbone had darkened, spreading like spilled ink across her skin. Her torn cardigan sleeve hung loose. To everyone in that courtroom, she looked exactly like what Stevenson claimed she was, a vagrant who'd gotten what she deserved. The gallery was filling now. Early morning courthouse staff, lawyers waiting for their cases to be called, court clerks with nothing better to do. Word had spread about the incident outside. People wanted to see the woman who'd claimed to be a judge. "Your Honor," Stevenson began, his voice steady and practiced, "I was conducting routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured toward Brianna with the casual dismissiveness one might use pointing out a stain on the carpet. "The defendant was acting erratically, Your Honor. Refused to provide identification when requested. Became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his reading glasses catching the overhead lights. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Stevenson?" Stevenson's response came smoothly, each word carefully chosen, each lie expertly layered. "Well, sir, she was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings. Carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents in an expensive briefcase, clearly not her own. When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats against my person. "Officer Willie," Prosecutor Reeves called. "Can you corroborate Officer Stevenson's testimony?" Willie stood from his seat in the gallery, his uniform pressed to perfection, a detail that spoke volumes about premeditation. He'd gone home after the assault and changed, made himself presentable for this exact moment. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident." Willie's voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced his lines. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Stevenson handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. She kept screaming about being someone important. You know how they get. From scattered seats in the gallery, two other uniformed officers exchanged knowing looks. They'd heard Stevenson tell similar stories dozens of times. Different faces, different days, same script. The playbook never changed because the playbook always worked. "These people," Stevenson continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. They think if they make enough noise, throw around enough accusations, they can talk their way out of consequences." Several white courthouse employees in the gallery nodded in agreement. They'd heard similar stories on the news, seen similar narratives play out on social media. It felt familiar, comfortable even, a narrative that confirmed what they already believed about people who looked like Brianna. In the back row, a young black law clerk named Maya Chin frowned, something nagging at her memory. But she remained silent, afraid to challenge the narrative unfolding before her. Judge Peterson adjusted his glasses. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest, officer?" "Absolutely, Your Honor." Stevenson's voice rose with righteous conviction. "The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety and the security of this courthouse." His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he spoke, the only crack in his polished performance, a tiny tell that he knew, somewhere deep down, that he'd crossed a line this time. Stevenson pulled out his phone, swiping to a video with theatrical precision. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor. Unfortunately, my body camera malfunctioned this morning. Technical issues with the new equipment, but I was able to capture some of the incident on my personal device." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey, sweet and smooth and utterly poisonous. From her position in the defendant's chair, Brianna murmured just loud enough to be heard, "How convenient." Judge Peterson's head snapped up. "I'm sorry." "Nothing, Your Honor," Brianna replied, her voice calm as still water. But her eyes blazed with controlled fury that made Stevenson shift uncomfortably. Prosecutor Reeves sensed an opportunity. "Officer Stevenson, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations?" "Unfortunately, yes, ma'am. There's a pattern here." Stevenson's voice rose with what he clearly thought was righteous indignation. "Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that rules don't apply to them. They use accusations of racism to deflect from their own criminal behavior. It's honestly insulting to the real victims of actual discrimination." The irony was so thick it practically suffocated the oxygen in the room. But Stevenson pressed on, oblivious to the trap he was constructing for himself with every word. "The defendant claims she was going to work," he said, making exaggerated air quotes that drew chuckles from parts of the gallery. "But she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area of this courthouse." A third officer, Thompson, who'd been standing outside during the assault, stepped forward. "If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential legal documents. Federal case files. We suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme." Judge Peterson leaned forward, suddenly more interested. "Fraud scheme?" "Yes, sir." Stevenson jumped back in, sensing momentum like a shark smelling blood. These documents had judicial letterhead, case numbers, sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to secure areas of the courthouse. He was testifying, under oath in open court, about how someone had stolen the identity of the person sitting right in front of him. The person whose courtroom this was. The person who had the power to destroy him. And he had absolutely no idea. In my professional opinion, Stevenson concluded, turning to face Brianna directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous, this is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. He held Brianna's gaze, letting his words sink in like knives. These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in MY Courthouse. The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Several court staff members shifted uncomfortably while others remained stone-faced, nodding along. Prosecutor Reeves added her voice to the chorus. The state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer, Your Honor. The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate defense strategy. Stevenson allowed himself a small smile. This was going exactly as planned. Another case, another win, another reminder that the system worked the way it was supposed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. Furthermore, he continued, emboldened by the supportive atmosphere, I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have used much more significant force. Judge Peterson nodded gravely. Your professionalism is noted, Officer Stevenson. Throughout the entire performance, Brianna sat perfectly still in the defendant's chair. Her hands were folded in her lap despite the handcuffs. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't smiling. She was taking mental notes. Every lie, every fabrication, every detail that would soon unravel not just their case, but their entire careers. She was witnessing her own character assassination in real time, watching as the system she dedicated her life to protecting tried to destroy her. The officer had no idea he was testifying in front of the very person who had the power to obliterate him. Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer? Judge Peterson asked. Stevenson straightened his shoulders, puffing his chest like a peacock displaying plumage. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement, Your Honor. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. Prosecutor Reeves stood, gathering her notes with barely suppressed satisfaction. The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and resistance to lawful authority. We recommend she be held without bail pending psychiatric evaluation. As Stevenson stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Brianna's eye one final time. And then, with the supreme confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, he winked at her. A gesture of complete dominance. Total victory. The kind of alpha male posturing that said I own you, and there's nothing you can do about it. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire career. In the holding room down the hall, Henderson was retrieving judicial robes from chambers. The 15 minutes were almost up. And when they were, Officer Mike Stevenson was going to learn what justice looked like when it finally had enough. The defendant may now present her statement, Judge Peterson announced, his tone suggesting this would be a mere formality before sentencing. But what happened next would shatter every assumption in that courtroom. Brianna rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Despite the purple bruise spreading across her cheek, despite the torn cardigan and disheveled hair, despite sitting accused of crimes she hadn't committed, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. There was something about her posture, her bearing, the way she held her head high despite the restraints. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice cut through the room like a bell, clear, controlled, carrying an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the space. It was the voice of someone who had commanded respect in courtrooms for 2 decades. It was the voice of power itself. Judge Peterson blinked. Something in her tone was unexpected, professional, precise. This wasn't the rambling of a mentally ill vagrant or the desperate pleading of someone caught red-handed. First, I'd like to address several factual inaccuracies in Officer Stevenson's testimony. Brianna's eyes swept the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had nodded along with the lies. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 7:47 a.m. this morning. She turned slightly to address Judge Peterson directly. "Your Honor, I'm certain you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The court stenographer's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Prosecutor Reeves frowned, her confident smile faltering. This wasn't the emotional outburst they'd been expecting. In the back row, Maya Chun sat up straighter. Something about this woman's voice, her mannerisms, the way she moved through legal arguments like dancing through steps she'd memorized decades ago. Furthermore, Brianna continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone completely comfortable in legal settings. Officer Stevenson testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely. She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been haphazardly collected. Those documents are indeed authentic federal legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Peterson interrupted, his discomfort growing with each passing second. "Miss, what exactly is your profession?" Brianna paused, and for the first time, allowed herself a slight smile. "Sinclair. Dr. Sinclair. And I believe we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." Officer Stevenson felt something cold slither down his spine. The confident smirk he'd worn just moments ago was melting like wax under flame. Something was very, very wrong with this picture. Beside him, Willie had gone pale, his hands trembling. "Your Honor, if I may continue," Brianna said, her voice now taking on steel. "Officer Stevenson also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during this morning's incident. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. Now, regarding Officer Stevenson's claim that his body camera malfunctioned." Brianna's voice dropped, became dangerous. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of alternative recordings when claimed evidence is unavailable. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court." Judge Peterson leaned forward, his judicial instincts now screaming that something unprecedented was happening. "What kind of evidence are you referring to?" "Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach." Her voice carried the practiced precision of someone who'd made thousands of such observations. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body camera footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions. The color drained from Stevenson's face like water from a broken dam. He'd forgotten. In his rush to control the narrative, to spin his familiar story, he'd completely forgotten about the courthouse security cameras. "I would like to formally request," Brianna continued with the practiced precision of someone who'd made thousands of such requests, "that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 7:45 and 8:15 a.m. This includes, but is not limited to, courthouse security footage, body camera backup files, and any mobile device recordings made by officers present at the scene." Prosecutor Reeves stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation." Brianna turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made Reeves take an involuntary step backward. "Your Honor, pro-se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. I'm simply ensuring that obligation is met." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases went. Ever. Judge Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Sinclair, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training?" "I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor." Brianna's response was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement. She was enjoying this, watching them squirm, watching the lies unravel thread by thread. "Your Honor," Brianna said, walking as much as the handcuffs would allow toward the evidence table, "I'd also like to address Officer Stevenson's characterization of my presence as suspicious or unauthorized." She pointed to a specific document among her scattered belongings. "This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to," she caught herself, a deliberate pause. "Excuse me. I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. Bailiff Robert Henderson, a large man who'd worked courthouse security for 18 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Brianna with growing recognition, his face transforming from confusion to realization to absolute horror in the span of 3 seconds. He knew that voice. He knew that bearing. He'd seen her every working day for 18 years. "Oh God. Oh God. Officer Stevenson testified that I claimed to be someone important," Brianna continued, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. "I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault." She paused, surveying the courtroom like she owned it, because she did. "Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Stevenson's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning." Judge Peterson's voice came out hoarse. "What kind of documentation?" Brianna reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly, deliberately. She knew procedure, knew how to avoid startling nervous people with power. "My federal judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office." She placed it on the table with deliberate care. "My building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's entry code." Another item, placed beside the first. "And my official identification." She held up a leather credential wallet, and even from across the room, the gold federal judicial seal was clearly visible, catching the fluorescent light like a badge of undeniable truth. Bailiff Henderson stood up so fast his chair toppled backward with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. "Your Honor," Brianna said quietly, her words dropping into the silence like stones into still water, "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Stevenson assaulted this morning. Perhaps we should recess," she suggested, not requested, suggested, "so that proper identifications can be verified." Judge Peterson stared at the credential wallet, then at Brianna's face, then at Bailiff Henderson, who was nodding frantically, his face pale as death, his hands shaking. Court will recess for 15 minutes, Peterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he brought down the gavel. As it fell, Officer Mike Stevenson felt his entire world beginning to crumble around him. The confident smirk had slid off his face entirely. His hands were shaking. Willie beside him looked like he might vomit right there in open court. Whatever game Stevenson thought he was playing, whatever power he thought he wielded, he was beginning to realize he might not have understood the rules at all. The gallery erupted in whispers that grew to urgent conversations. Everyone was pulling out phones, texting, calling. The young law clerk was already typing furiously, her fingers flying across her screen as she sent messages to attorneys throughout the building. You won't believe what's happening in 4A. In 15 minutes, everything would change. Justice was about to remove her blindfold. During those 15 minutes, the courthouse transformed from a place of routine procedure into a powder keg of nervous energy. Behind closed doors, the truth was being confirmed. And 2 police officers were about to learn the true meaning of consequences. In the small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking so badly he could barely unlock the handcuffs binding Brianna's wrists. Reality was hitting him like a freight train. He'd stood by and watched as officers dragged a federal judge through the courthouse in chains. "Judge Sinclair," he whispered, his voice thick with horror. "Jesus Christ, Judge Sinclair. I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that." "It's all right, Henderson," Brianna replied softly, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had bitten deep into her skin. "You weren't part of this. But I need you to do something for me. Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all." Henderson had been her bailiff for 18 years. He'd seen her preside over thousands of cases, watched her deliver justice with fairness and unwavering principle. He knew exactly what kind of judge she was, and what was about to happen. "I need you to go to my chambers quietly," Brianna said, her voice steady despite everything. "Bring me my judicial robes. The black ones with the gold trim." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "And Henderson, bring my gavel too. The engraved one for my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously. He understood exactly what was about to happen. This wasn't just about clearing up a misunderstanding. This was about justice, raw, uncompromising justice. He hurried out, leaving Brianna alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself the way she'd learned to do during 20 years on the bench. This morning, she had been Judge Brianna Sinclair, respected jurist, protector of constitutional rights, guardian of the law. In the span of 30 minutes, she'd been transformed into a victim, a defendant, a woman in handcuffs facing fabricated charges. But that transformation was temporary. Her career flashed through her mind like a highlight reel. Harvard Law School, magna cum laude. Editor of the Harvard Law Review. 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division, specializing in cases involving police misconduct. 52 successful prosecutions against law enforcement officers who'd abused their authority. Appointed to the bench at age 35. The youngest federal judge in state history. She declined 2 nominations for the state Supreme Court, preferring the immediacy of trial work. She'd written the Judicial Ethics Handbook now used throughout the state. She was known for being tough but fair, with zero tolerance for perjury and zero tolerance for abuse of power. Now it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. Janet Morrison, her clerk of 10 years, had sent increasingly frantic texts. "Judge Sinclair, where are you? The Morrison custody case is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Judge Sinclair, please call back. There are rumors something happened." Brianna typed back quickly, "Tell the Morrison attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my afternoon calendar. And Janet, this is important. Do not come to courtroom 4A. Stay in chambers." She scrolled through her contacts until she found Chief Judge Margaret Davis, the administrative head of the entire judicial district. They'd been friends for 25 years. Margaret had been her mentor when she first joined the bench. "Margaret, it's Brianna." "Brianna. Thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better." "Margaret, I need you to do something without asking questions right now." "Of course. Whatever you need." "I need you to contact the courthouse security office immediately. Tell them to preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning. Time frame, 7:45 to 8:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Margaret, make sure there are multiple copies stored in different locations. I don't want any accidental deletions." There was a pause on the other end. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had changed. She knew something serious had occurred. "Brianna, what exactly happened this morning?" "A police officer named Stevenson just spent an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal trespassing on courthouse property." Brianna's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Margaret had never heard before. "And the dangerous criminal was me, Margaret. On my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of this courthouse. Called me trash, told me I belonged in a cage. And then he lied about it. Under oath. In my courtroom." The silence on the other end stretched for 30 seconds. Finally, "Jesus Christ, Brianna. What do you need? Should I call the FBI? The Attorney General's office?" "Not yet. Right now I need those surveillance recordings secured. And I need you to make some phone calls. I want every case Officer Stevenson has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and reviewed. Every single one. I have a feeling this isn't his first time. Consider it done. But Brianna, you can't handle this case yourself. There's a conflict of interest. You're the victim. Margaret, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Officer Stevenson is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning. And more importantly, who has the power to ensure he faces consequences. This is my courtroom. My jurisdiction. And he committed perjury in my presence. I'm not the victim anymore, Margaret. I'm the judge. And it's time to do my job." Outside the holding room, word was spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. People pulled out phones, texting and calling. "You won't believe what just happened in 4A. The woman in handcuffs might be Judge Sinclair. Oh my God, did those cops just assault a federal judge?" In the hallway outside the courtroom, Stevenson paced frantically, his face pale and slick with sweat. Willie sat on a bench with his head in his hands. "Mike, did you see her ID? Did you even check?" Willie's voice cracked with panic. "Shut up, Willie. Just shut up. It's fine. It's going to be fine." But Stevenson's voice betrayed him, cracking on the last word. He was trying to convince himself. Officer Thompson, the third officer who'd corroborated their story, was quietly slipping away, already on his phone with his union rep, trying to distance himself from the impending catastrophe. Attorneys scheduled for other cases began gathering in the hallway. They sensed something historic was happening. Maya Chun, the young law clerk, was furiously researching on her laptop. She'd pulled up Judge Sinclair's biography, and her eyes went wide as she read. Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. He walked past Stevenson and Willie without a glance, his contempt palpable. "Hey, what's in the—" They tried to stop him, but he didn't even acknowledge their existence. He knocked on the holding room door. "Your robes, Your Honor. And your gavel." He unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes with gold trim. Brianna stood and slipped them on, feeling the transformation begin. The fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each fold was a reminder of the power she wielded, the oaths she'd taken, the justice she'd sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel. Its weight was familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on the handle were the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." A gift from her father, also a judge, when she'd been sworn in 20 years ago. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, but now it served a different purpose. Not just evidence of Stevenson's brutality, but a symbol of how far the system had fallen, and how completely it was about to be restored. "When we return to the courtroom, how would you like to be announced?" Henderson asked. Brianna straightened to her full height, every inch the federal judge she'd been for 2 decades. The Honorable Judge Brianna Sinclair presiding. They walked toward the courtroom door, Henderson leading the way, Brianna following in her full judicial regalia. Her robes flowed behind her like wings. The gavel was solid in her hand. Her face was set with determination. At the courtroom door, Henderson paused and looked back at her. "Your Honor, are you ready?" Brianna's response was immediate and unwavering. "I've been ready for 20 years. Let's show them what accountability looks like." Henderson opened the door. His voice boomed through the courthouse, "All rise." The moment of reckoning had arrived. "All rise." Bailiff Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone snap to attention. But what happened next would be seared into their memories forever. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Brianna Sinclair presiding. The announcement hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Several people gasped audibly. Officer Stevenson, who'd been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid. His face transformed in the span of 3 seconds, confident smirk melting into confusion, confusion crystallizing into realization, realization exploding into absolute horror. Judge Peterson, still seated in what he now realized was decidedly not his chair, turned pale as death. He stood so quickly he knocked over the water glass on the bench. It shattered on the floor, a symbolic sound of something breaking irreparably. No one moved to clean it up. All eyes were locked on the judge's chamber door. Prosecutor Sandra Reeves's mouth fell open. Papers scattered from her hands like autumn leaves. She grabbed the edge of the table for support, her ambitious dreams of promotion evaporating in the span of a single sentence. Officer Willie went from pale to green in seconds. He looked like he might vomit right there in open court. His hand shot out to grab a chair to keep from falling. The gallery erupted in absolute chaos. Lawyers jumped to their feet. Phones came out despite recording being forbidden. Whispers became urgent, conversations became shouts. "Oh my God. Did he say Judge Sinclair? Holy shit, they arrested a federal judge." And then she entered. Brianna Sinclair walked through the judge's chamber door wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights like fire. She moved with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. In her left, a case file containing all the evidence that would destroy the men who'd assaulted her. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, stark and purple against the formal black of her robes. It created a powerful juxtaposition, victim and judge simultaneously. The wounded warrior coming to deliver justice. Every step was deliberate. The sound of her shoes on the courthouse floor echoed in the sudden complete silence. She didn't look at Stevenson or Willie. Didn't acknowledge Peterson or Reeves or anyone in the gallery. She simply walked straight to her bench, her courtroom, her domain. She sat down slowly, deliberately. Adjusted her robes with practiced movements that spoke of 2 decades of routine. Placed her gavel in front of her with a soft click that somehow sounded like a door locking. Opened her case file. Took a moment to survey her courtroom. Her eyes swept the room slowly, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Every person who'd witnessed the assault and done nothing. Every person who'd believed Stevenson's lies. Her gaze landed on Prosecutor Reeves, who was frozen mid-motion, still trying to gather her scattered papers, still trying to distance herself from the catastrophe unfolding before her. "Counsel, you may be seated." Brianna's first words from the bench were calm, professional, and terrifying in their absolute control. Her eyes moved to Judge Peterson, who stood clutching his papers like a life raft, looking like he desperately wished the floor would swallow him whole. "Judge Peterson," Brianna said, her tone crisp but not unkind. Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. She paused. You may return to your own docket. I'll handle this matter from here. Peterson practically ran from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him like he was being chased by demons. The door slammed shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Brianna turned her attention to Officer Stevenson. He was standing but swaying slightly, like a tree about to fall. Officer Stevenson, she said quietly, but her voice carried the full weight of judicial authority, you may remain standing. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Stevenson looked like he was about to be sick. His face had gone from red to white to green. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands shook visibly. He tried to speak, but no words would come. Officer Willie, Brianna added, you may also remain standing. Willie looked younger than his 32 years, his face streaming with sweat, his eyes darting toward the exit though he knew he couldn't run. Officer Stevenson, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony? Stevenson couldn't form words. Let me refresh your memory. Brianna pulled out a transcript the court reporter had provided during recess. You stated, and I quote, these people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. Do you remember saying that? Stevenson nodded weakly, incapable of speech. You also stated that I was another entitled activist looking for a payday. That you had seen this playbook before. Is that accurate? The courtroom was so quiet that the humming of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. And perhaps most memorably, Brianna's voice grew colder. You stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, actions have consequences. Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom? Stevenson's legs were shaking so hard he could barely stand. Brianna reached under her bench and pulled out a tablet computer. Officer Stevenson, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention. She turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance. Her finger touched the screen, starting the video. Let's watch together, shall we? Crystal clear security footage filled the screen. Multiple angles showed Brianna walking calmly toward the courthouse in her teal cardigan and jeans, carrying her briefcase, minding her own business. Then Stevenson blocking her path. His mouth moving, and the audio kicked in, another ghetto rat trying to sneak in. Several people in the gallery gasped. Willie's voice, this is a courthouse, not a homeless shelter. More gasps. The video continued, showing the unprovoked assault in vivid, undeniable detail. The rough grab. The kick that sent her crashing to the concrete steps. The handcuffs wrenched tight. Everything. And then the audio, trash like you doesn't belong in a place of justice. Stevenson's own words, spoken with such venom, echoed through the silent courtroom. Several people in the gallery stood up and walked out, unable to watch anymore. Brianna paused the video. Officer Stevenson, do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats? Stevenson remained silent, his career disintegrating before his eyes. Now, let's examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned. She swiped to a new video file. This is backup footage from your own body camera, automatically uploaded to the county's cloud storage system every 60 seconds. A system you apparently forgot existed. The new video began playing, and Stevenson's voice filled the courtroom again, but this time it was even worse. This was the complete, unedited version. Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into MY Courthouse. These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson. Prosecutor Reeves was frantically gathering her papers, trying to flee. But Brianna wasn't finished. Not even close. Officer Rodriguez. Officer Thompson. Both men, who testified earlier, were edging toward the exit. You both testified under oath that Officer Stevenson handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements? Both officers were already halfway to the door. They knew their careers were over too. And here, Brianna said, advancing the video, we can see the moment when Officer Stevenson committed felony assault. She paused for effect. Against a federal judge. She let those words hang in the air. Stevenson's knees buckled. He grabbed the prosecutor's table to keep from falling, his breathing labored, his face gray. He was broken. But wait, Brianna said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. There's more. This is audio from Officer Thompson's body camera, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning. A new voice filled the courtroom. Thompson speaking to Rodriguez. Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying. Rodriguez's response. Nah man. Look at her. Stevenson knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system. Laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. The few remaining spectators stared at Stevenson with undisguised revulsion. Some were crying. Others were filming despite the rules. Everyone knew they were witnessing something historic. Officer Stevenson, Brianna said, setting down the tablet, you asked me earlier if I had any employment verification. A slight smile. Well, I do. She gestured to the judicial seal mounted on the wall behind her bench. Then to her nameplate. Then to the oil painting of herself hanging in the courthouse lobby, visible through the courtroom windows. I've been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 20 years, Officer Stevenson. Every case you've ever testified in. Every warrant you've ever requested. Every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction. All under MY authority. This is MY Courthouse. My courtroom. My domain. Stevenson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Your Honor, I didn't know. You didn't know? Brianna repeated slowly, dangerously. You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless. And you decided to abuse that perceived power. Her voice dropped, became steel. But Officer Stevenson, there's something else you didn't know. The courtroom held its breath. What could possibly be worse than what they'd already learned? For the past 6 months, I've been conducting an investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this police department. Working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Stevenson's face went completely white. This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Stevenson. You've been under investigation. And you just provided us with the most perfect evidence we could have hoped for. She lifted her gavel and held it before her. Officer Stevenson, you said actions have consequences. You were right about that. Court will recess while I consider the appropriate charges. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Final. Definitive. The sound of justice being served. Stevenson collapsed into a chair, his career, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom hanging by a thread. When the gavel fell, it didn't just mark the end of a recess. It marked the end of an era where officers like Stevenson could brutalize with impunity. The reckoning had begun. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had been a routine morning arraignment had become the most talked-about case in the courthouse's 50-year history. And Officer Mike Stevenson was about to learn that justice wasn't just blind, it had teeth. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Every seat in the gallery was now filled with lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters drawn by whispers of the most spectacular courtroom reversal in the building's history. Some stood along the back wall. Others pressed against the windows from the hallway outside. Everyone wanted to witness this. Outside, local news crews were gathering, unable to bring cameras into the courtroom but waiting for statements. National news was already picking up the story. Hashtag Judge Sinclair was trending on social media. Federal judge assaulted by racist cop, then takes the bench. Two FBI agents in dark suits had quietly entered and taken seats in the front row, taking notes. They'd been working with Judge Sinclair on the investigation for months. This was exactly the break they'd needed. Stevenson sat slumped in what was now clearly the defendant's chair, his uniform wrinkled, his face ashen. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in 2 hours. Beside him sat Michael Brennan, a nervous public defender who'd been hastily summoned. He kept shooting worried glances at his client, already knowing this case was unwinnable. Willie sat beside Stevenson. His attorney hadn't even arrived yet. He kept looking toward the door, hoping for escape, but bailiffs were positioned at every exit. No one was leaving until Judge Sinclair said so. Brianna returned to the bench with the same measured dignity she displayed thousands of times before. But now every eye saw her differently, not just as any judge, but as the woman who'd been brutally assaulted by the man now trembling before her bench. "Officer Stevenson," she began, her voice carrying the full weight of 20 years of judicial authority, "before we proceed with the serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court and everyone present deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood, moving around the bench to address the packed courtroom directly. "My name is Judge Brianna Sinclair. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 20 years. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2001, confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous vote. I was 35 years old, the youngest federal judge in state history." Stevenson's attorney scribbled notes frantically, probably calculating how many years his client was facing. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice." She paused, letting that sink in. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor, I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 52 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority." Another pause. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 12,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every justification." She walked closer to where Stevenson sat cowering, her robes flowing behind her. "But in all my years of service, Officer Stevenson, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect example of everything that is wrong with policing in America." She returned to her position behind the bench. "You see, Officer Stevenson, when you called me trash, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen. You were assaulting the person who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers like you are held accountable." She opened a thick file that had been placed on her bench. "This file contains detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Stevenson. 43 times you've stood in MY courtroom and sworn to tell the truth." She flipped through several pages. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the arresting officer. And in every single one, Officer Stevenson, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning." Her voice became sharper. "Acting erratically. Refusing to comply. Becoming aggressive. Threatening officer safety." The same words, the same narrative, the same lies. Over and over again. She closed the file with a sharp snap. "But here's what you didn't know, Officer Stevenson. For the past 6 months, I've been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice to investigate systemic patterns of racial bias and misconduct in this police department. The public defender stopped writing and simply stared at his client with pity. Your name, Officer Stevenson, appears on a federal watch list. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed. She leaned forward slightly. And this morning, Officer Stevenson, you provided us with the most perfect, most unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could hope for. She lifted her gavel and held it before her. You assaulted a federal judge while she was performing her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed perjury when you lied under oath about the circumstances of that assault. The gavel hovered in the air. The charges against you are as follows. Count 1, assault in the first degree, a Class B felony. Count 2, assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Count 3, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Count 4, perjury in the first degree, a Class D felony. Count 5, false imprisonment, a Class A misdemeanor. Count 6, official misconduct, a Class A misdemeanor. She turned her attention to Willie. Officer Willie, you're charged with conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, accessory to assault, perjury, and official misconduct. She addressed Stevenson directly once more. Officer Stevenson, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. Let me tell you exactly what my place is. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the power we've entrusted to you. The gavel came down once. My place, Officer Stevenson, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. Brennan stood shakily. Your Honor, given my client's years of service. Brianna cut him off. Counselor, your client used those years of service to systematically violate the constitutional rights of dozens, possibly hundreds, of citizens. That's not a defense. That's an aggravating factor. Bail is denied. Officer Stevenson poses a flight risk, has demonstrated a propensity for violence, and has access to weapons. He will be held without bail pending trial. Bailiff Henderson, please place Officers Stevenson and Willie under arrest. Henderson moved forward with handcuffs, the same handcuffs they'd used on her just hours before. The irony was not lost on anyone. As the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, Stevenson finally broke down completely. Your Honor, please, I have a family. Brianna's response was ice. So did the people you brutalized over the years. So did the teenagers you falsely arrested. So did the grandmothers you called slurs. Did you think about their families? As Henderson led them toward the door, Brianna added one final statement. Officers, you told me that trash doesn't belong in a place of justice. You were right about that. She paused. And now you're going to learn exactly what happens when the trash is taken out. The courtroom erupted, not in applause, but in stunned, awed silence that gave way to whispers, then louder conversations. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Lawyers shook their heads in amazement. Some were crying. This was history being made. As the two men who had brutalized a judge on courthouse steps were led away in the same handcuffs they'd used on her just hours before, Brianna sat back in her chair. She picked up her gavel and set it down gently. She looked out at the packed courtroom. This court stands in recess. Justice has been served. But this was only the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. The arrest of Officers Stevenson and Willie sent shockwaves through not just the courthouse, but the entire city. Within hours, the story had gone viral. Within days, it would spark a movement. And within weeks, it would transform an entire justice system. At 2 p.m. that same day, Chief Judge Margaret Davis and Judge Brianna Sinclair stood on the courthouse steps, the same steps where the assault had occurred just hours earlier. Dozens of cameras pointed at them, reporters from around the country jostling for position. Margaret spoke first, her voice steady as she outlined what had happened. Then she introduced Brianna. Brianna stepped to the microphone, still wearing her judicial robes, a powerful visual that would be replayed on news channels for days. The bruise on her cheek was clearly visible in the afternoon light. This morning, I was assaulted by 2 police officers for the crime of being black while approaching my workplace. She paused. But I was also fortunate. Fortunate to have the power, the position, the authority to hold my attackers accountable. Most victims of police brutality don't have that luxury. Her voice grew stronger. Today isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens to countless others who don't have judicial robes to protect them, who don't have cameras to vindicate them, who don't have the system on their side. This ends today. She announced a comprehensive federal investigation into every case Stevenson and Willie had touched, every arrest, every testimony, every use of force. If you believe you or a loved one was a victim of misconduct by these officers, please come forward. You will be heard. You will be believed. You will get justice. A special hotline was set up. Within the first hour, 47 calls came in. By the end of the day, 213. By the end of the week, over 600 calls. Stories of abuse, misconduct, and violence, some going back 15 years. The pattern became undeniable. The media frenzy was immediate. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all covered the story. Federal judge assaulted, then delivers justice from bench. Video of Brianna in her robes taking the bench went viral. 15 million views in 24 hours, 50 million by the end of the week. On social media, hashtag Judge Sinclair trended #1 worldwide. Hashtag Justice for Judge Sinclair and hashtag Know Your Place, reclaiming Stevenson's hateful words, flooded timelines. Images of Brianna's Harvard Law photo, her in handcuffs, and her on the bench became symbols of resilience, justice, and power. Think pieces proliferated. What Judge Sinclair's case reveals about systemic racism. When justice wears a robe, how one judge changed everything. Law review articles were being written in real time. This case would be taught in law schools for decades. That evening, a vigil was held on the courthouse steps. Hundreds gathered with candles and signs. Justice for all was the theme. And for the first time, former victims of Stevenson's abuse came forward to share their stories publicly. Rosa Delgado, now 75, told her story from 2009. He called me the same things he called Judge Sinclair. But when I filed a complaint, they said I was lying. Today, I finally feel heard. Jamal Washington, now 29 and a successful engineer, spoke through tears. He planted drugs on me when I was 17. Destroyed my scholarship chances. Took me years to rebuild my life. But today, I feel vindicated. Dr. Michael Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, shared his experience. He arrested me outside my own home. Said a black man couldn't possibly live in that neighborhood. They dismissed my complaint as unsubstantiated. Today proves I was telling the truth. Police Chief Robert Morrison held a press conference, stating, "We are cooperating fully with the investigation. These actions do not represent our department. We take all allegations seriously." But his words rang hollow. Outside police headquarters, protesters gathered, demanding systemic change. Internal affairs logs told a damning story: 47 complaints against Stevenson over 15 years, all marked unsubstantiated or unfounded. 23 complaints against Willie over 10 years, also dismissed. The pattern of protecting bad cops became obvious and undeniable. The police union initially defended the officers. They were just doing their jobs. Judge Sinclair should have identified herself. The backlash was swift and severe. The union was forced to retract the statement within hours, but the damage was done. Public trust had been shattered. The FBI's Civil Rights Division moved fast. Agents interviewed over 100 witnesses in the first week. They subpoenaed Stevenson's personnel file, communications, and financials. They discovered he'd been investigated internally 3 times, all investigations buried by supervisors. Statistical analysis of Stevenson's arrests revealed the truth. 87% of his arrests were people of color in a 42% white district. 63% use of force against people of color, only 12% against white suspects. The pattern of racial bias was crystal clear. Prosecutors began reviewing every case Stevenson had touched, for 132 cases over 15 years. 187 defendants were still incarcerated based on his testimony. Emergency hearings were scheduled. Some prisoners were released within days. Others had sentences reduced or charges dropped entirely. Within a week, 23 civil rights lawsuits were filed against Stevenson, Willie, and the police department, alleging false arrest, excessive force, and civil rights violations. The county's insurance company estimated liability at over $50 million. County commissioners held an emergency meeting and began settling cases immediately to avoid trial. Payouts ranged from $50,000 to $2 million. The total reached $37 million in the first month alone, with more cases being filed daily. The Department of Justice placed the entire police department under federal consent decree, requiring an independent monitor, mandatory bias training for all officers, body camera requirements with no exceptions, a civilian oversight board, and automatic review of all use of force incidents. Within 2 weeks, 12 officers were terminated, including 2 supervisors who'd covered for Stevenson. 4 more faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice. The police union tried to fight it, but public pressure was too great. New protocols were implemented, mandatory federal review of any case involving judicial personnel, automatic investigation of any officer with 5 or more complaints, body cameras that couldn't be turned off or malfunction, triple backup systems, and complaints going directly to an independent review board. Despite her strong exterior, Brianna struggled. The assault had left her with PTSD. She had nightmares about being powerless. Therapy helped, but some wounds took time to heal. Yet support poured in from around the world. Other judges who'd faced discrimination shared their stories. Young black girls sent drawings of her in robes with notes saying, "You're my hero." Harvard Law dedicated a lecture series in her honor. Brianna took 1 week off to recover. She considered early retirement. But ultimately, she decided to return. If I leave, they win. This is my courtroom, my jurisdiction. And I'm not going anywhere. 6 weeks later, Brianna returned to the bench. The courtroom was full, everyone standing to welcome her back. The applause lasted a full minute. She picked up her gavel and brought it down once. Court is now in session. Business as usual. But everything had changed. The system was better because one woman had refused to be silenced. Justice had won. But the fight was far from over. 3 months after that fateful morning, Officer Mike Stevenson sat in a federal courtroom, not as the arresting officer, but as the defendant. And the judge presiding over his fate was not Brianna Sinclair, but someone with an even longer memory for police misconduct, the Honorable Judge Marcus Williams, who had fought alongside Brianna in the Civil Rights Division for a decade. The federal courthouse was larger than the county courthouse, packed to capacity with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Security was tight, metal detectors, bag searches, armed marshals at every entrance. The tension was palpable, electric. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chun, a specialist from the Civil Rights Division with a reputation for being methodical and relentless. The defense had brought in Gerald Masterson, a high-profile criminal defense attorney hired by the police union, expensive, aggressive, and known for getting cops acquitted. Judge Marcus Williams, African-American, 62 years old, was known throughout the federal system for being fair but uncompromising on police misconduct. He'd worked cases with Brianna for years. He knew exactly what kind of officer Stevenson was. The jury, 12 diverse citizens carefully selected over 2 weeks, sat watching everything with intense focus. Brianna sat in the front row of the gallery, not testifying yet. She'd be saved for the prosecution's key witness. She wore a professional suit, the bruise long healed, but cameras captured her every reaction. She was the story even when silent. Sarah Chun stood for the prosecution's opening statement, her voice calm but carrying steel beneath. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a simple proposition, that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. And that includes police officers who swore an oath to uphold it. She walked the jury through the morning of the assault, using photos of Brianna in her teal cardigan and jeans, casual, unthreatening, ordinary. Then she showed the video. Even edited for trial, it was devastating. Several jurors visibly reacted. One older white woman gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. But this case isn't just about one morning, Chin continued. It's about a pattern of abuse spanning 15 years. A pattern of targeting citizens based on skin color. A pattern of lies under oath. A pattern that ended only because Officer Stevenson finally attacked someone with the power to stop him. Masterson took a different approach in his opening, sympathetic, reasonable, almost apologetic. My client made a terrible mistake. A mistake that he deeply regrets. But a mistake is not a crime. His voice was smooth, practiced. Officer Stevenson had no way of knowing that the woman approaching the courthouse was a federal judge. He was doing his job, protecting courthouse security. Things escalated tragically. But there was no criminal intent, no racial animus. Just a good cop having a bad day. The first week focused on video evidence. Courthouse security footage from 5 different angles. Body camera footage from all 3 officers. Cell phone footage from witnesses. The prosecution presented a composite video showing the assault from multiple perspectives simultaneously. It was devastating. An FBI forensic audio specialist testified about cleaned-up audio from the body cameras. Stevenson's exact words were clearly audible, "Ghetto rat. Trash like you. These people. Not in MY courthouse." The defense tried to argue the audio had been tampered with. The expert shut it down with technical analysis so thorough even Masterson stopped objecting. Week 2 brought the witnesses. Bailiff Henderson took the stand first, his voice breaking with emotion. "I've worked with Judge Sinclair for 18 years. She's one of the finest jurists I've ever known. What those officers did, it was barbaric." Then came the previous victims. Rosa Delgado, now 76, frail but determined, described Stevenson's assault in 2009. The language was eerily similar to what he'd used with Brianna. "He said I was a ghetto rat. Said people like me needed to learn our place." She was crying. The jury was crying. The defense tried to object on relevance, but Judge Williams overruled. This was pattern evidence, and it was coming in. Jamal Washington, now 29 and a successful engineer, described the 2012 incident when he was 17. Stevenson had planted drugs on him, destroyed his college scholarship. "He told me thugs like you belong in cages, not colleges." Nearly identical language to the Brianna assault. The jury took extensive notes. Dr. Michael Johnson, a respected cardiologist, testified about being arrested outside his own home in 2016. Stevenson hadn't believed a black man could live in that neighborhood. 6 hours in jail. Complaint dismissed as unsubstantiated. Today feels like vindication, but it took 7 years. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a criminologist from Stanford, provided statistical analysis of Stevenson's 15-year arrest record. The statistical probability of this pattern occurring by chance is less than 0.00001%. This is clear evidence of systematic racial bias. She detailed the numbers: 1,089 arrests over 15 years. 87% people of color in a 42% white district. Massive use of force disparities. Similar language patterns in reports. 40% of cases thrown out. This is not the profile of a good officer having a bad day, she said, her voice clear and authoritative. This is the profile of a predator who targeted vulnerable populations. Masterson tried to poke holes, suggesting poverty, crime rates, other factors. Dr. Martinez systematically destroyed every argument. I controlled for all those variables. The racial bias remains statistically significant. On day 12 of the trial, Brianna took the stand. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. National media covered it live. Brianna was sworn in wearing the same style suit she'd worn 3 months ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Sarah Chun walked her through that morning. Brianna was calm, professional, detailed. She described the assault moment by moment. But she also described her fear. I've been a judge for 20 years. I've seen violence in my courtroom countless times. But I've never been on the receiving end. And in that moment, handcuffed on those steps, I wasn't a judge. I was just a black woman, powerless against men with badges. Chin asked about the testimony Stevenson had given in her courtroom. Brianna's voice grew harder. Sitting in MY courtroom, listening to him lie under oath about brutalizing me on my own courthouse steps, that was almost worse than the assault itself. Because it showed he had no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing. Just calculated manipulation of a system he thought would always protect him. Masterson stood for cross-examination, trying to be respectful but firm. Judge Sinclair, isn't it true you weren't in judicial robes? Yes. And you weren't wearing your judicial credentials? They were in my briefcase, which Officer Stevenson prevented me from accessing. But you could have identified yourself earlier? I tried to. He refused to listen. Then Masterson made his mistake. Isn't it true that if you'd been dressed appropriately? Brianna cut him off. Counselor, are you suggesting that the Constitution only protects well-dressed citizens? That civil rights are contingent on wardrobe choices. The jury perked up. This was good. I was walking on a public sidewalk, approaching my workplace, in casual clothes. That is not a crime. That does not justify assault. And Officer Stevenson's assumption that I was somehow less than because of my skin color and my clothes, that's not a defense. That's exactly what we're here to address. Masterson retreated quickly. No further questions. As Brianna stepped down, the courtroom buzzed. Everyone knew the prosecution had just sealed the case. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The nation watched and waited. Brianna sat in a private room, trying to stay calm, knowing the verdict could go either way. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood. We the jury find the defendant. A long pause. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Judge Williams banged his gavel for order. Stevenson collapsed in his chair. Brianna closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Not joy, but relief. Justice was done. Outside the courthouse, Brianna made a statement to the gathered press. Today, the system worked. But it only worked because I had power, position, authority. We must do better. Every victim deserves this outcome, not just the ones wearing judicial robes. The verdict was in. But the real work was just beginning. 6 months after Officer Mike Stevenson learned that actions have consequences, Judge Brianna Sinclair sat in her chambers, reviewing the final report on the systemic changes implemented since that morning. The numbers told a story of transformation, but the real story was in the lives that had been changed forever. 3 weeks after the verdict, Stevenson returned to the same federal courtroom for sentencing. Judge Marcus Williams presided. Stevenson wore a prison jumpsuit and shackles now, looking broken, aged 20 years since that morning. His family sat in the gallery, crying quietly. The court allowed victim impact statements. 17 of Stevenson's victims spoke, one after another, reclaiming the dignity he tried to steal. Rosa Delgado, you robbed me of my dignity. Today I'm taking it back. Jamal Washington, you tried to destroy my future. But I succeeded despite you. Dr. Johnson, you made me question my worth. Never again. Each statement added weight to the sentencing. Then Brianna spoke. Your Honor, Officer Stevenson asked me if I knew my place. He told me people like me don't belong in places of justice. But here I am, still standing. Still serving justice. Still believing in a system that, despite its flaws, can and must do better. She paused, her voice steady but carrying emotion beneath. I don't want vengeance. I want accountability. I want Officer Stevenson to understand that every person he brutalized was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. That they all deserved the dignity he denied them. Judge Williams delivered his decision, his voice grave. Mr. Stevenson, you were entrusted with significant power. You abused that power systemically over 15 years. You destroyed lives, families, futures. And when finally caught, you lied under oath. He paused, looking directly at Stevenson. You are sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. You are permanently barred from law enforcement, and you will pay $2.3 million in restitution. The gavel fell. Stevenson was led away, never to wear a badge again. Officer Willie faced a separate trial and was sentenced to 7 years for his role. Also barred from law enforcement. His career over at 32. 6 months later, the statistics told a remarkable story. Use of force incidents in the police department were down 67%. Complaints against officers were down 52%, but more importantly, complaints were being taken seriously now. The Independent Review Board processed all complaints. No more unsubstantiated dismissals without real investigation. Federal oversight continued. Mandatory bias training every 6 months. Body cameras with triple backup systems. Automatic federal review of any use of force incident. The Civilian Oversight Board had real power now. Community policing initiatives required officers to live in the communities they served. 12 officers had been terminated. 4 supervisors faced criminal charges. 187 wrongful convictions had been overturned. $87 million paid in settlements. But more importantly, trust was slowly being rebuilt. The impact spread nationally. Brianna's law was proposed in Congress. It would mandate federal oversight of police departments with patterns of civil rights violations. Named after Judge Sinclair, it had surprising bipartisan support. Reforms spread to other jurisdictions. Judges around the country reviewed cases. Other bad cops were exposed. A pattern of accountability was replacing the pattern of protection. The case was now taught in every constitutional law class. Sinclair versus Stevenson had been cited in 47 legal opinions. Judge Sinclair gave lectures around the country. Young law students saw her as a hero. Therapy had helped Brianna with her PTSD. She still had nightmares occasionally, but she'd reclaimed her power. She was stronger than before. What doesn't kill you makes you more determined, she often said. Her father, a retired judge, told her he was proud. You did what I always taught you, stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Her sister, a civil rights attorney, joined her in advocacy work. The city council insisted on renaming the building Justice Brianna Sinclair Courthouse. She protested, I'm still working here. But they insisted. A bronze plaque was placed near the entrance, the same spot where she'd been assaulted. Here one woman's courage changed everything. Rosa Delgado, 76 now with failing health, had attended Stevenson's sentencing. I lived long enough to see justice. I can rest now. She passed away peacefully 2 months later. Brianna attended the funeral and gave a eulogy about courage and dignity. Jamal Washington used his settlement money to start a scholarship fund, Stevenson Survivor Scholarship, for young people of color affected by police misconduct. The first year awarded 15 full-ride scholarships. "Turn trauma into triumph," he said. Dr. Johnson continued practicing medicine but also became an advocate, training police on implicit bias. Education is more powerful than anger. He worked with the department to improve community relations. 1 year to the day, hundreds gathered on the courthouse steps. Not to mourn, but to celebrate the progress made and recommit to the work continuing. Brianna spoke to the crowd. "1 year ago, I was assaulted here for the crime of existing while black. Today we stand here together, a community transformed by accountability. But our work isn't done. It will never be done. Because justice isn't a destination. It's a daily practice." The police department's new recruit class, the most diverse in history, 60% people of color, 45% women, took their oath on those same steps. Brianna administered it, a symbolic moment, from victim to authority figure administering the oath to officers. "Do you swear to uphold the Constitution? To serve with integrity, honor, and respect for all?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then welcome to the force. Do better than those who came before you." Late that afternoon, golden light streamed through the windows of Brianna's chambers. She was preparing for tomorrow's docket. Routine had returned, but everything was different. A letter sat on her desk from a young black girl. "Dear Judge Sinclair, I'm 10 years old and I want to be a judge like you. My teacher says I can be anything, but I didn't believe her until I saw you. Thank you for showing me it's possible. Thank you for fighting back." Brianna wiped away a tear. Henderson knocked. "Judge Sinclair, they're ready for you." Tomorrow's emergency hearing. Another case of police misconduct. This time, the officers were already suspended. The department was taking it seriously. Change was happening. Brianna put on her judicial robes and picked up her gavel, the same one from that day. She walked down the hallway toward her courtroom, passing her portrait on the wall. In the painting, she wore her robes, dignified and powerful. The plaque beneath read, "The Honorable Brianna Sinclair, Courage Under Fire." She entered her courtroom. Her courtroom. Where she'd been dragged in handcuffs. Where she'd reclaimed her power. Where justice had been served. All rise. She took her seat and looked out of the full courtroom. Lawyers, defendants, victims, families. All seeking justice. And she was here to deliver it. She lifted her gavel. "Court is now in session." She brought it down. The sound echoed through the courthouse. The same sound that had marked Stevenson's downfall. The same sound that had marked the system's transformation. The same sound that would continue marking justice, day after day, case after case, for as long as she sat on this bench. Justice, Brianna Sinclair had learned, wasn't about one dramatic moment. It wasn't about one viral video or one historic verdict. It was about showing up every single day, in robes or civilian clothes, with a gavel or empty hands, and demanding that the system live up to its promise. She was still here. Still fighting. Still judging. And every time that gavel fell, it echoed with the voices of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in a place of justice. They belonged. She belonged. And she wasn't going anywhere. 5 years later, Officer Stevenson was eligible for parole. Denied. Judge Brianna Sinclair was nominated for the state Supreme Court. This time, she accepted. The police department's transformation was studied nationwide as a model for reform. Brianna's law passed Congress and was signed into law. The young girl who wrote the letter was now 15, applying to Harvard Law. Brianna wrote her recommendation letter. The cycle of justice continued. Not perfect. Never perfect. But always striving to be better. Because one woman refused to accept that people like her didn't belong. She belonged. They all belonged. And the system, finally, was beginning to understand that. Judge Brianna Sinclair's story reminds us that courage isn't about never feeling powerless. It's about reclaiming your power even after someone tries to take it away. It's about standing up, speaking truth, and demanding accountability even when the system seems stacked against you. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about justice and accountability, I need your help to share it with others who need to hear it. Every share, every comment, every conversation this story sparks is another step toward the world Judge Sinclair fought for, a world where justice truly is blind to everything except the truth. Here's what you can do right now. Backhand index pointing right, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, a friend fighting their own battle, a young person who needs to see what courage looks like, or someone working to make the system better. Speech balloon, leave a comment below telling me which moment in Judge Sinclair's story hit you hardest. Was it the assault? The courtroom reveal? The sentencing? Your story matters, and I want to hear it. Bell subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who refused to accept injustice, who stood up when others sat down, who proved that one person really can change everything. Because here's the truth. Judge Sinclair's story isn't just about what happened in one courthouse on one morning. It's about what happens every single day when people decide they've had enough. When they decide their dignity is worth fighting for. When they decide that people like them do belong, everywhere. Don't let this story end here. Share it. Discuss it. Let it inspire action. The gavel has fallen. But the conversation is just beginning. What will you do with the power you have?
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.